atakapofika mbele ya askofu mweka wakfu Padre Mkuu Elirwanyoike, atamtambulisha na kisha kumwomba mwe katika daraja ya uaskofu.
Baba mheshimiwa sana, kanisa la jimbo la Embu linaomba umweke Padre Peter Kimani Ndung'u katika madaraka ya uaskofu.
Je, manayo hati ya kitume ya Baba Mtakatifu?
Ndio, tunayo.
Na isomwe.
Taonyeshwa sasa hati ya Baba Mtakatifu. Ndio hiyo, tupige makofi. Itasomwa sasa kwanza kwa lugha ya Kilatini na kisha kwa lugha ya Kiswahili.
Francescus Episcopus, Selfus Forum Dei, Delecto Filio Petro Kimani Ndung'u, Ecrelo ac Dioceses Metropolitane Nairobiensis, Hec tenusque, Capellano Cacerano in Kenya, Episcopo Ebuensi nominato, Salutatem et benedictionem, quindivies est in misericordiae, propter caritatum sum, quam delicti nos, convica vivificat nos, Christo et cum, cuis gratia salvati domus in eundem. Cole sutati nos, creatos in Christo Jesu, in opera bene, che preparafit Deus, ut in filis ambulemus, quo spirituatis, profectus et Christiane, navitatis candine suffrit, Dominicum Grantis custode, intel in vigilare os fungue eterni, pastoris pastorari caritati presta fare satangiantes paterna directione endi spiritualities necessitates mentum inflictumus ecclesiaris communitatis embuensis, che vacanze in presensi post translationem post telem sacrorum ant stitatis sui venerabilis fratris Pauli Karaoke Jirum. Ad diocesum votenesem nupel electam nufu sum expartit pastorem et fite diocesano moderatorem communus delecti fili nobis tipi committere visum est qui communi combrate estimationis et spiritualim humanonque dotum ornamento in capitavis commitandos sufurus indonios fidelis et hec postaria munia obiedia proinde audito consiglio di castelli pro evangelizzazione apostoliche nostro autoritatis plenitude episcororum embuensis te constituemus debit datis illipus construesquo imposatios obligationibus concedimus ut ordinationem episcopalem extra urbem suffitis liturgici noms catholico episcopo quem erigis suspias premissionis finde professione et in ulando fidelita elga nos successorique fostras secundum sacro canones ec di nostro decreto in dioceas forumunus crelum et populum us ecclesiaris communitatis quos extotatum ut te patrem deligendo magistorumque audiemus accipiant actua ductit moderatione Christ voluntatem sincero corde in condianit vita and adempiant hec ovidia tibi commentantes deum exoramus qui conchandit tipi spiritum sapientia et revelationis in agione sui et granci ist tipi commendatio illuminatos oculos cordia ut sciatque sit spes vocationis eius datum Rome Laterane 15 mensis Augusti in solemnitate Assumptionis Beate Maria Virginis anno Domino millesimo ficesimo quarto pontificatus nostri duodecimo Franciscus Papa.
Itasomwa sasa kwa lugha ya Kiswahili.
Hati ya Baba Mtakatifu, Jimbo la Embu. Francisco, askofu mtumishi wa watumishi wa Mungu, kwa mwana mpendwa wetu Peter Kimani Ndung'u, padri wa Jimbo Kuu la Nairobi, na hadi sasa padri mlezi wa kiroho wa magereza nchini Kenya, aliyeteuliwa kuwa askofu wa Embu. Salamu na baraka. Yeye aliye mwingi wa rehema, kwa sababu ya upendo wake mkuu anaotupenda nao, hutuhuisha pamoja na Kristo, na ambaye kwa neema yake tunaokolewa, hutuinua pamoja naye, tuliyeumbwa katika Kristo Yesu, tutende matendo mema Mungu aliyotangulia kutayarisha ili tuenende ndani yake. Waefeso sura ya 2 mstari wa 4 hadi wa 6 mstari wa 10. Tukiungwa mkono na ukuzi huu wa kiroho wa msingi wa utendaji wa Kikristo, tukiwa makini daima juu ya utunzaji wa kundi la Bwana na kujitahidi kuwahifadhi kondoo wa mchungaji wa milele kwa upendo wa kichungaji, tunayawaza kwa upendo wetu wa kibaba mahitaji ya kiroho ya jumuiya ya kikanisa Embu, ambayo kwa sasa iko wazi baada ya kuhamishwa kwa mchungaji wake Mheshimiwa sana wa mwisho ndugu Paul Kariuki Njiru kwenda jimbo la Wote lililoundwa hivi karibuni. Jumuiya sasa inangoja mchungaji wake mpya na msimamizi wa maisha ya jimbo. Kazi hii, mwana mpendwa, tumeamua tukukabidhi wewe, ambaye uliyejaliwa kuwa na sifa adhimu na pambo la karama za kiroho na za kibinadamu. Baada ya kuthibitishwa katika kuandamana na wafungwa, unaonekana kwetu kuwa wa kufaa kazi hizi za uchungaji. Kwa hiyo, baada ya kusikiliza shauri la idara ya uinjilishaji kwa utimilifu wa mamlaka yetu ya kitume, tunakuteua kama askofu wa Embu, kukupa haki zinazofaa na kuweka majukumu yanayoambatana na kazi hiyo. Tunakuruhusu kupokea daraja ya askofu nje ya Roma kwa mujibu wa kanuni za kiliturujia kutoka kwa askofu Mkatoliki utakayemchagua baada ya kufanya ungamo la imani na kiapo cha uaminifu kwetu na kwa waandamizi wetu kwa mujibu wa kanuni takatifu. Tunatamani wajulishe hati hii wa klero na watu wa jumuiya hii ya kikanisa, ambao tunawahimiza wakupokee kama baba mpendwa na mwalimu makini, na kutimiza mapenzi ya Kristo kwa mioyo ya dhati katika maisha yao ya kila siku chini ya uongozi wako. Tukikukabidhi majukumu haya, tunakuombea kwa Mungu ili akupe roho wa hekima na ufunuo katika kumjua yeye, na kwa kundi lililowekwa chini yako waangazwe nuru mioyoni mwao, wapate kujua tumaini waliloitiwa na Mungu. Imetolewa Roma Laterani siku ya 15 Agosti katika maadhimisho ya sikukuu ya kupalizwa mbinguni kwake Bikira Maria katika mwaka wa Bwana wetu wa 2024 wa 12 wa upapa wetu Francisco Papa.
Tuseme wote tumshukuru Mungu. Kwa utulivu tusikize homilia ya Mhashamu Askofu.
papal bull, as it was read this morning, as you understood, is written in Latin, and it comes from Rome. And it comes also in Latin to the nunciature. And so we have in one way or another to translate it, which is not always easy, though me, myself, and my secretary, Monsignor Luciano, are quite fluent in Latin, and Monsignor Luciano even more than me, but sometimes we sit like a day on translating that Latin because it's not for a first-class student, first-year student. You need to have a bit of practice to do that. And so when I've heard it again read today, I was very consoled because I thought the way I struggle with Swahili, others struggle with Latin. So therefore, I feel a bit relaxed this morning. But we are not here to speak about Latin. Today, dear Monsignor Peter, we come because of you, because of this special day, as we are going to witness the Episcopal ordination of yet another Christian of the Church in Kenya. And I think that many of you know, and it was also here shown this morning, that Father Peter Kimani has been working for years as a chaplain in the prisons. He knows that world and its citizens inside out. In many ways, we, ordinary people, we try to stay away from prisons and from its inhabitants. We even fear going there. It is a system which for many is shrouded in darkness and mystery behind walls and barbed wire fences. It's not something that you would do for a Sunday outing. And if you go there to visit maybe your family or your friends, you even will reflect twice whether you should bring your children along. In old times, the prison was called a carcer or a dungeon. And it implies a very dark and sinister system that people really want to keep away from. In many ways, that concept of dungeon is of course also connected to our idea of purgatory or hell even. And let's face it, even if the prison is clean and provided with all kinds of facilities, a hell it remains. To be robbed of your freedom is always a difficult thing to accept. To be behind bars and in chains is not what the average person desires in his life. Father Peter Kimani comes from that kind of reality. He has worked there for many years, and he came to know the prisoners by name. He listened to their stories and came to understand their fear and frustrations. Yes, sure, some of the prisoners may have committed heinous crimes, but even they, the worst of criminals, have families, have children, have dreams, and even have good intentions. People can be murderers and rapists, but there are also many other things than that. That is what Peter Kimani came to know about those prisoners. He came to know those human stories about their pain and their suffering in the prison system. Peter worked so long in the prisons that his friends started to call him the prisoner, because it seemed he would never get out of there again. A lifelong sentence it was, so it seemed. The life of Peter Kimani, reminds me in a way of the life of St. Paul the Apostle. Actually, frankly speaking, I was a bit surprised that in the choice of the readings of today, that aspect was not highlighted. Paul calls himself a prisoner of Christ, and he speaks more than once of him being in chains for Christ. Peter Kimani, in many ways, is like St. Paul of Tarsus. Paul, you may not know it or you never realize it, Paul was imprisoned a lot. Clement of Rome, one of our saints, claims that Paul was 7 times behind bars. Paul himself says about himself that he suffered far more imprisonments than any of his rival apostles. And we, as Christians, as church, we have imagined many reasons why Paul was in prison. Because he was a philosopher. Maybe Paul was a political prisoner. Or Paul was just wrongfully accused. And Paul, the Roman citizen, had asked for a trial, and therefore he was taken to Rome to be there under house arrest. And finally, from there, he was executed. He was beheaded. Poor people, people without a stable residence, considered to be a public nuisance, bore the brunt of what we would call casual administrative violence, as well as short-term imprisonment under local magistrate who just want to keep the peace. We must accept that Paul inhabited, as it sometimes is called, Paul inhabited a whippable body, one that could be hit or be locked away by the local authorities without too much of noise, with impunity. You could imprison people very easily for some kind of vague accusation like disorderly conduct. Paul's treatment was the same for many in ancient Rome, especially if you were poor, homeless, or of an ethnic group that marked him as a part of an occupied people. Which is to say, Paul looked a lot like those who get over-policed and thrown into jail today, not only in Kenya, but all over the world. And even today, many of our judicial systems contribute to the same. Some of our people will be thrown into prison for relatively minor violations, while others, especially for crimes that involve more than 10 million shilling, or those who have powerful friends, they will never make it to prison. You might have committed a heinous crime, but you will be able to escape prison unscathed. There is a saying that the law is the same for everybody, but not everybody is the same for the law. The Church of Philippi provided resources to Paul, wanted to be with Paul during and after his incarceration. They wanted to meet his physical needs. They brought him to eat. They brought him clothing. They became like a social safety net. And the Philippians in that time sent a man called Epaphroditus to Paul to make sure that he had the means of surviving behind bars. And they wrote letters back and forth with Paul while he was in prison in that time. And they even prepared a guest room for him when he was finally released. These basic forms of support, sending visitors into prison, writing letters, opening our homes to people getting out of prison, are still basic needs, basic tasks that are needed today. Father Peter Kimani was involved in all this, and he could explain it much better than me. By the way, Holy Scripture doesn't make any attempt to prove the innocence of Paul as he is in prison, but rather his incarceration becomes like a place of special intimacy with Christ. Paul himself never exhibits any evidence that he is being pressured to explain about why he had to go to prison. He himself says, "I do not feel any need to defend myself, to elaborate on my innocence, or make a case for his own exemplarity." Paul ended up a number of times in prison. We would call him nowadays a repeat offender. And one can imagine the magistrate hearing about his past incarcerations, that the magistrate would be inclined to impose on him again a prison term. As it is said, once you have been in prison, there is a high chance that you will return there again. In fact, the imprisonment of Paul was accepted by his friends and followers as a routine case. It happened to so many. There were people who saw his incarceration as a kind of way of maintaining social power. It was not so much about being guilty or being innocent, but you were a victim of the game between the powerful forces. Rather than regarding Paul as a charity case or as a person to be corrected, the friends, the disciples of